Okay, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining the talk. My name is Eoghan Glynn. I'm the Director of OpenStack Engineering at Red Hat. I've been around the OpenStack community for over a decade at this stage in various different roles, as an individual contributor, as an engineering manager, involved in various different projects. I'm also the current Red Hat Platinum member board seat. So I'm involved in the governance structure of the foundation as well, right? So I guess, what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'd say the tweet-sized summary of the talk essentially is the story of basically of how Red Hat came to be the leading contributor to OpenStack, right? So note there that I've struck out the word dominant, because that's never been part of our DNA. And that's not part of our goal here, domination, right? And that kind of feeds into the motivation for this actual talk. So why actually propose this topic in the first place? And it kind of comes from some concerns that have been bubbling up in general across the community over time. It certainly came up at the board meeting in Berlin this time last year, when we had the board meeting just in advance of the summit. And the technical committee presented at that board meeting and basically described some concerns around how the shape of contribution, right, and the diversity of contribution within the OpenStack community was exposing us to certain risks, right? And those risks are kind of obvious, right? But let's call them out, right, just to be sure. You know, the obvious risk that a lot of people jump to is the existential risk, right? The fact that if we have more than half of the contributions coming from a single company, then all of the community's eggs are in that basket, that single basket, right? And it's an existential risk in terms of that company maybe withdrawing their investment from OpenStack. Now, be assured, that's not on the agenda, right? That's not something that's a live possibility, but obviously it's something that causes concerns, right? But it's not just in terms of that existential risk that worry is caused, I guess, by this, under diversification. Part of it as well is people think about issues like corporate capture, right? So that's basically the sense that one company will establish a chokehold over a community, right? And basically steer that community in directions that are of interest to it and its business, but aren't necessarily of the general kind of benefit to the community, right? Now, that's not clearly something that Red Hat is in the business of doing, right? Our DNA is very much based on being active and constructive contributors to open source communities. It's the whole reason we exist, right? But we can see why it causes concern, right? And why people might worry about that, right? And part of my purpose here in this talk is to rebut a potential misconception that can arise, right? And that misconception basically is around the sense that, is dominance of the community a goal of Red Hat? Is this something we set out to achieve? And in fact, the opposite is true, right? This is not the outcome that we were aiming for, right? This is not our preferred outcome, and we would prefer a more kind of multipolar kind of scenario where there was several other very large contributors, right? But this is the way things have panned out. Okay, so let's have a look at what this actually means in reality, right? So we look at some data, right? And I'll review the trend of contribution and Red Hat's share of contribution from the Newton cycle up to now. And I'll explain why I picked the Newton cycle in a second. We look at some kind of potential kind of drivers here, right, that have caused this dynamic to arise, right? And also, I'd like us to think about mitigations, right? What can we do? What do we have in our power to change? And what changes are already in motion, right? And I think there are some very genuine reasons to be positive about the sustainability and future longevity of the OpenStack community, right? And I'll talk about some of those as well. So let's jump to the data, right? I love data. I'm a very kind of visual thinker, right? But I tried to keep this presentation really, really simple, right? So if you're interested in more detailed data, right, I definitely recommend you check out the Bitergia OpenStack dashboard, right? That contains a ton of very detailed views, right? And you can slice and dice in all kinds of different ways, right? So definitely have a look at that. They're in the marketplace as well this week. You know, I think they're running a metrics corner, right? And that's definitely worth looking at, right? But these data, just for the purpose of getting across a simple message, right, are really stripped down to the absolute minimum, right? So the source is essentially Stackalytics, right? And all I did, as you can see from the URL at the bottom of the slide there, is essentially just cycle through the per release breakdown in Stackalytics, right? Starting in Newton and going through the first round of the alphabet and then back around to Antelope, right? Now, the reason I picked Newton is simply this. Our productization of OpenStack, right, exists in the wild with several different versions, right? And a big chunk of the value proposition to our customers is the longevity of support, right? And the oldest version of OpenStack we currently have out there used in a fully supported form is OSP 10, right? And that version was based on Newton, right? So as far as I'm concerned, the modern era kind of starts at Newton, right? Because that's the oldest version we currently have supported, right? So as you see there, the blue trend line represents the total number of commits. Now, I could have done this analysis based on any other contribution metrics, right? So reviews is another popular way of looking at this. And I would have come up with a similar shape, right? But let's just go with commits because that's where, in a sense, the rubber meets the road. The actual code is being entered into landed in the repository, right? So the blue trend line is the total across all projects and all contributors, right? And the red trend line is Red Hat's contribution, right? And as you can kind of see here very clearly, Red Hat's contribution has bounced around within a relatively narrow band, right? And that's reflective of the fact that our actual investment in OpenStack has remained relatively static, right? So the number of engineers, basically, on the Red Hat OpenStack team has stayed within a fairly narrow band over that period of time, right? And the work that they do kind of follows that fairly flat gradient, right? Whereas if you look at the total, you see this unrelenting downward trend over time, right? Now, there's a number of kind of blips over it, and we can kind of explain those blips, right, that are kind of superimposed over that pattern. So you see, for example, there was a big blip around Okata, right? And those folks who were around in the Okata timeframe probably remember it was a shorter cycle, right? So we were resetting the kind of calendar of OpenStack. So the Okata cycle, instead of being a full 6 months, was only, say, 4 months, right? I can't remember the exact details. So that's why you have that downward blip over there to the left-hand side of the overall trend line, right? Then in the other extreme, right, you see between Z and Antelope, there's also another inflection point, right? And I'd probably explain that in terms of us winding down the O project, right? So the O project has been the deployment framework that Red Hat has supported for many cycles, right? It did involve a lot of commits, right? Because it touched every part of OpenStack, right? And it was it had a lot of sub-projects feeding into it. So we've wound down our involvement in O, right? And you see that effect there between Z and Antelope, right? Both for the total number of commits and for Red Hat's commits. There's a bit of an elbow in Red Hat's trend line as well, right? So there are the two big inflections. You see a little bit of an inflection as well around train, right? You see around the train release, there's a bit of a dip. So I was trying to figure out why that might have been caused, and I was thinking it might have had something to do with sleep deprivation within the community, right? And the reason for that is the train cycle name came from the PTG that was held in Denver, right next to a very busy railway line, right? That I think kept people up in the middle of the night with cargo trains going past, etc. So that's why the train cycle was called train, and as you can see, there was a little bit of a dip there as well. So if we superimpose over those two trend lines, the percentage of contribution, the contribution share that's coming from Red Hat, right? You see a very unmistakable pattern happening there, right? The yellow trend line there that basically shows from Newton, we had, I think, around 19% of all commits, right? And we had this very solid rise over time. And it peaked out, I think, at Yoga, which we had 51% of all commits, right? So clearly, that's a kind of scenario in which people's alarm bells were going off in terms of the sustainability of such a large share of the commits coming from one company. And then we see it dip off again, and that's probably mainly due to the O wind down that I mentioned. Okay, so what might have been the drivers here that got us to this point? What can we read from our historical knowledge of how OpenStack evolved over time? Well, there's a couple of very kind of clear drivers here, right? I'm probably not telling you anything new, right? These are kind of well-known elements of the dynamic, right? But one thing that happened, right, was that there were many companies that had a large contributor group involved in the OpenStack community, and essentially their investment in OpenStack didn't work out, right, for whatever reason, right? It might have been that their business model was flawed from the get-go, right? So the concept now of attempting to compete head-on with the hyperscalers, right, to provide kind of massively scaled-out public clouds, right? It was probably like in retrospect, that was probably a very ambitious goal to have, and it didn't really work out in reality. And there were other business models or other ideas that companies had around monetizing and creating a business around OpenStack that were maybe ahead of their time, right? For whatever reason, we had a number of companies with large investments in groups of contributors that essentially they stepped away from OpenStack, and they moved their people to work on other things, right? Another factor that I think we should call out and should acknowledge is the big tent era in OpenStack, when there was a lot of openness to spinning up new projects, and there was a ton of different projects, some of them duplicating each other. There was a ton of mission creep, right? Where the whole mission of OpenStack extended beyond just providing the basic foundational infrastructure primitives, right? And extended into all kinds of more higher level things, right? That was very well intended, and it was driven by a lot of energy within the community. But I think it kind of hurt us in the long run, right? It hurt us in terms of just spreading resources too thinly, right? And after that kind of explosion, I kind of liken it to geologic time, right? It felt like a kind of a Cambrian explosion of new life forms, right? But without maybe the corresponding mass extinction events that are kind of needed so that the fittest survive, right? And some of those projects maybe fell below critical mass, but stuck around for a bit too long and kind of bled off some of the energy from the community, right? Another lesson that I think we should acknowledge, and this has been a hard lesson for Red Hat ourselves and other contributor companies that have tried this, is that if you start a project, right, and you end up with just a single company contributing to that, there's just a single vendor, it's kind of the mono affiliation model, I call it, right? It's not really a path to success, right? Because you're missing some of the real key value points of actually doing this in open source in the first place, right? You don't get the force multiplier, right? And you don't get the diversity of perspectives, right? The kind of drivers towards high quality and high levels of generality, right, that you get in a truly diverse open source project, right? And we found in particular the pattern that OpenStack projects that were very focused on deployment tooling, right, tended to fall into this trap, right? So O would have been the one that Red Hat was involved in, but there were other big deployment focused projects that really didn't attract interest from beyond the company that was actually promoting them, right? And that's essentially, I think, an anti-pattern that didn't help in terms of building a sustainable community. Okay, so that's I suppose some of the historical drivers at least that led us to this place, right? But I want a kind of a somewhat positive message to come from this as well, right? And I think anyone who's been watching the community closely over the past couple of years, right, can't fail to notice that a lot of resilience has been shown, right? The community is kind of like almost like a self-healing organism, right? So obviously there was a number of challenges put in our path, right? And the community hasn't just dug its head into the sand, basically, and ignored those challenges, but instead has tried to come up with creative ways to essentially deal with the what I would say are the switch from a kind of a era of resource abundance, right, where there was almost too many people interested in contributing to OpenStack, right? And one of the big challenges was just harnessing all of that energy and dealing with that rapid scale out, right? And dealing with the kind of the transition from that era of an abundance to an era of scarcity, right? Where there's far fewer contributors, right? And we need to kind of change some of the structures that were designed with that abundance in mind, right? So examples of that, there are loads, right? But I just added a few to this particular slide to give you a flavor of it. So one is the technical committee has been significantly scaled back, right? So originally, I think it had maybe 13 members, right? It's been scaled back to something like 9, right? So it's a much smaller group. It's a much more focused group, right? And there was, or there still is, a bylaw on the books that basically prevented a majority of the technical committee members who provide the kind of overall cross-project technical oversight, a majority of them all coming from the same company, right? That was the kind of the diversity requirement or the diversity threshold. That's under active consideration currently at the board level as to whether we want to actually keep that, right? So that's interesting. The actual project leadership model has been made significantly more lightweight, right? So there was a hard requirement previously that every project had a designated PTL or project technical lead, right? That's obviously been changed with this distributed leadership model, right? And instead you can have designated liaisons who liaise with the release management team or the vulnerability management team or whatever it is, all of these kind of cross-cutting concerns. Certainly with the advent of COVID, as well as the general kind of, I suppose, reduction in appetites of companies to pay for a lot of travel, the foundation and the community have applied a lot of creativity to thinking about events such as this, right? So a bunch of innovation around running PTGs in virtual mode, the whole Open Infra Live series, a lot of focus on presence at regional events. So kind of a regionalization of the event focus. So it might be, say, OpenStack or Open Infra Day Korea or Open Infra Day France or whatever. Those kind of regional events have received a lot of investment and a lot of energy from the community, right? Because they're generally much more cost effective to run, right? Because you got a smaller group of people, less distance to travel, et cetera, right? And then of course you've got the release and lifecycle optimizations, right? And the big change here is when the alphabet of releases switched over, right? In the new model, right, we've got this kind of what's called a slurp or the skip level upgrades release process, right? Where essentially there is support for a very easy way to skip every second release, right? So you can, for example, go from the Antelope release to the C release. We'll say it's called Coyote. I don't know what it's going to be called in reality, but you can go direct from Antelope to Coyote as opposed to, and that will be tested upstream and fully quality assured upstream, right, in ways that it wasn't previously. There's actually a forum session on right now about the extended maintenance mode, right, clashing with this session, and that's basically talking about rationalizing some of those quite labor-intensive efforts. Okay, so one thing that occurred to me when I was writing this deck was, what if we were a business, right? Just a thought experiment, right? Now, communities aren't businesses, obviously, right? But the entities that actually back communities and make the investments in our communities are themselves business. And we all work for a company. We've all seen how the mood music has shifted over the last 6 to 12 months. We've all heard about all of the, the layoffs, et cetera, that have been happening in the tech industry, right? So basically, what kind of strategies are applied generally by companies when they're in a kind of a similar bind, right? Now, it's not necessarily we're going to do exactly the same thing within a community, right? We can maybe draw some parallels here and learn some lessons from the typical things that are applied, right? So one thing you'll hear a lot of, basically, is focusing on the most important things, right? And really kind of ruthlessly identifying the initiatives or the efforts or the projects that are kind of falling below critical mass, right, in terms of the impact that they're making, right? And either combining those together, deduplicating, and culling things that essentially don't have a bright future ahead of them, and essentially deciding on what are the most important things to you, right, or to your business or to your community or whatever, and essentially really focusing in very, with a laser kind of focus on those most important things, right? Clearly, we're all in the business of optimizing spending, and you can see it just by looking around the event, right? We've got a half-empty room here. And in fairness, the number of people at this event is probably lower than was originally projected, right? And some of that is driven by travel budgets, right? And I think some of it as well in this particular case was driven by geopolitical concerns and a lot of people not being able to get visas to travel to Canada. But even so, basically optimizing spending so that we get the maximum return of investment is clearly a thing business would do under these circumstances. We want to look at ways of making contributors individually more productive, right? So if your resourcing envelope is static or shrinking, what are you going to do, right? You need to figure out ways via automation, via tooling, via ways of working, right, to essentially enable people to be more productive, right, than they were previously, and to kind of remove any barriers to that productivity or remove any parts of our process that are too manual or overcomplicated or basically don't give us as much of a direct kind of return on investment, right? Another thing that I think is well worth keeping in mind, and it kind of feeds into Red Hat's continuing commitment to OpenStack, is this notion of keep doing what's working, right? But just modernizing or updating the playbooks that have been proved to be successful in the past, right? And that modernization is something that Red Hat is very focused on currently, right? So I think this is my compulsory kind of inspiring picture slide, right? Every presentation's got to have one. But I think it sums up our commitment and our continuing commitment to OpenStack despite that historical shrinkage, right? You know, that commitment is unwavering, right? And these are easy words for someone to say, right? And what makes these words actually believable and actually credible? Well, I think the reason that it is very believable and credible is that we're making big investments in essentially reshaping our product, our OpenStack product, right? With a view to keeping it relevant in the marketplace for the next decade, right? We are not acting like a company, right, that has its eye on the exit door, right? So we're essentially, if you're at some of the other Red Hat presentations this week, you may have seen, you know, talk about how we're essentially converging our OpenStack offering with our Kubernetes distribution, which is called OpenShift, right? And we're bringing the more modernized operational experience of OpenShift to our OpenStack customers, right? And that involves a ton of work, right? And we're doing that work, we're making those investments because we believe in OpenStack's relevance for another decade, right? So essentially, this is not just a utopian message, right? This is a message that's based on hard, cold business facts, right? Red Hat sees a lot of relevance, a lot of appetite for OpenStack, and I think that's going to continue, right? And we continue to see a lot of benefit in being involved in a community, right? That community is obviously smaller, right? But despite being right-sized, I think it's still highly robust, highly resilient, and there's still a ton of creativity and engineering, or creativity and enthusiasm within that community, just waiting to be to find an outlet. And we're very interested in being part of that. So let's talk about some reasons why we might be positive about the future, right? So while all of this has been going on, right, obviously we've witnessed the seemingly unstoppable rise of Kubernetes, right? And folks who've been involved in the OpenStack community for a long time have probably noticed a drift in some of the talent, right? Some of the leading lights from the OpenStack community that were maybe around a decade ago, right? A lot of those folks have actually moved on and found a niche for themselves, making an impact on Kubernetes, whether that's an impact upstream or in one of the many distributions of Kubernetes or one of the many cloud services that are based on Kubernetes, right? It's also obviously soaked up a ton of corporate interest, right, and a ton of investment, yeah? So you might see that as kind of negative points, right? But I also see quite a lot of positivity in the parallel rise of Kubernetes, right? And I don't really see it as overshadowing OpenStack, right? And in fact, it's actually provided us with a couple of really interesting opportunities, right? So one is there are obviously a bunch of different layering and convergence plays, right, that are possible where the best of Kubernetes and OpenStack can be combined, right? The foundation refers to this using the Loki acronym, right, that you've probably heard in the keynotes, and it's something that they talk about a lot, right? And essentially that's the idea that you've got an adjacency, right, or a complementary nature, right, between OpenStack and OpenShift, right? And you can layer them or run them side by side in various different ways, right, and benefit from their coexistence, right? So you can imagine layerings that might involve OpenStack acting as the infrastructure as a service layer, right, and providing an environment in which you can run many Kubernetes clusters, right? So in product terms, at Red Hat, we call that shift on stack, right? Like OpenShift on OpenStack, right? But essentially the idea is not new, it's not specific to Red Hat. Lots of other companies have similar offerings, right? And in that case, you're playing to the strengths of OpenStack and OpenShift. So OpenStack does what it does best, which is to provide the low-level infrastructure layer, so compute, networking, storage, right? And then basically Kubernetes layers over that, right? And basically provides that, that sense of, you know, kind of a more modernized set of application deployment primitives, right? The other thing that I think was beneficial, right, about the rise of Kubernetes as far as OpenStack is concerned is that it actually gave us some very useful scope clarity, right? And one of the problems that, or one of the challenges that the community ran into that I talked about earlier in the presentation was this kind of sense of mission creep, right? Where we started doing a thing, right? And then we thought, well, maybe we could do one layer up in the abstraction stack and maybe several layers up, right? Whereas Kubernetes very definitely owning the kind of the platform as a service space, I think it's really reconcentrated minds within the OpenStack community on doing what we do best, right? Focusing on our kind of core competencies. In a sense, staying in our lane, right? But in a kind of a positive read on that. Another thing to be, I think, positive about is that when you look at the actual deployed footprint of OpenStack, right? Where it's being used in the wild and how widely it's being used in the wild, the rise continues, right? And it's actually, that rise is continuing like unabated all through the period of COVID, when obviously there was a lot of challenges, there was a lot of economic challenges and so on. But the numbers kind of tell a fairly unmistakable story here. So if you look, for example, at the user survey, right? So this is a survey that the OpenStack, the Open Infra Foundation does every year, right? And reaches out to a whole bunch of users, asks a bunch of questions. But one of those questions is about the number of deployed cores powered by OpenStack that you currently have, right? They tot up all of the numbers, right? And they come up with an estimate for the worldwide total, right? And as you see there from 2020 through 21 through 22, right? The numbers have been growing at about, the trend has been about 60%, right, year on year, right? So it's gone from like 15 million to 25 million to more than 40 million in the last published set of results from 2022, right? So that's like an amazing rise, right? That's continuing, you know, kind of despite all of the economic challenges, right, that are facing many businesses, right? So that's the kind of total. So that would include commercial distributions. It would also include quite a few operators of OpenStack who are essentially consuming directly from the community and doing their own kind of roll your own deployment. But the commercial distributions, like for example, Red Hat OpenStack and others, Canonical OpenStack, et cetera, we've essentially won some really key markets, some key vertical markets like telco 4G, right? That, you know, telco 4G is almost synonymous with OpenStack. The technology is absolutely ubiquitous within that space, right? And that's just one example. Another example of an emerging trend where OpenStack has increasing relevance, right, and people see a lot of value in it, is basically AI and ML workloads, right? And that's something you would have seen a recurring theme within the keynotes yesterday, and it's something that basically I think is part of this kind of exciting future for OpenStack. What else are we seeing that's kind of on the positivity side of the column, right? Anything else that's basically we could interpret as some green shoots? Well, one thing that I noticed when I was doing that data mining in Stackalytics, right, and looking at the trend over, you know, all of the cycles from Newton to Antelope, right, was that while a few names were constants, right, so we obviously had in every single one of the top 10s that Stackalytics reported, we had kind of Red Hat was there, and Canonical was there, and Ericsson were there, and NTT Data were there, et cetera, right? But we also had some new logos emerging in more recent cycles, right? One example, I just picked one that popped up in some of those more recent cycles was the BBC, right? So a beloved institution from the UK, which obviously does a lot of things as well as broadcasting, right? And they've kind of entered the top 10 in the last few cycles, mainly on the back of their contributions to OpenStack Ansible. So that's positive, right? That's good. That's showing that the overall community has got some resilience, right? And it's continuing to grow. So another thing that we've seen is I talked about events and the innovation around virtual PTGs, but in a sense, there is no substitute for face-to-face, right? That, just standing around a whiteboard, the creative energy flowing, right? Hard problems being solved, right? And the fact that we've made some baby steps back in that direction, right? We actually have a PTG this week co-located with the summit. After canceling, there was an attempt to run a face-to-face PTG last year, and it didn't really reach the kind of the viability threshold, right? But this year we've done one in Vancouver for 2 days, and basically just getting people back together in the same room, right, is incredibly valuable in my view, and the fact that people are willing to do it, right, is a really positive sign, right? Because while well-established community members can work mainly remotely, onboarding new members of the community is really hard, right, without some face-to-face contact, right? So I think it's a real positive sign that we're slowly getting back to some face-to-face contributor-oriented meetings as opposed to marketing and business-oriented meetings, right? And then one last thing I just want to throw in there, right? A little bit of a curveball, but just an idea I wanted to implant was clearly there's been a massive amount of hype about generative AI, right? You can't open a newspaper or look at a news website the last 6 months without being absolutely bombarded, right, with things about, Bard and ChatGPT, et cetera, right? And clearly one of the very powerful use cases that a lot of people are very interested in and are already exploring, right, is around essentially automating elements of the code writing process, right? Now, clearly, in an open source environment, there are some very specific challenges here, right? Because attribution and licensing is very important to us, right? Because we're all about a intellectual commons and ensuring that basically people get credit for their work, right? So if you have a scenario where something like GitHub Copilot X, for example, is trained on a corpus of text that includes a bunch of open source code that is protected by various different permissive or non-permissive open source licenses, right? Well, then that introduces some issues around what the generated code, how it should do the attribution, et cetera, right? So that's a challenge. Code quality is obviously a concern for a lot of people. So if you ask any of these generative models to reverse a linked list, it'll give you a perfect answer, right? Not necessarily so if you ask it to write some more sophisticated or complex code. And there was a study out of, I think it was Stanford University at the start of the year, that looked at some generated code in terms of manually written code and the propensity for vulnerabilities to be introduced into the code base. And that's still a problem, right? That said, though, I think it's a very obvious productivity booster for the future, right? Particularly for the mechanical, energy-sapping tasks, right, that we spend a lot of our time on, like doing backports of fixes, right? You land a fix in master, how many stable branches do you have to backport it through, right? And how many of those kind of mechanical tasks, right, don't really need human input all of the time at least, right? So this is something we're very interested in at Red Hat. We're investing in an extension to Ansible called Ansible Lightspeed, which is based on some similar ideas here. And the idea is never to displace people from their jobs, right, or replace software engineers, but the goal is to reduce the cognitive load, right, and to make us all more efficient, right? So this is an example, I think, of something into the future where we can make individual contributors individually more productive, right? So with that kind of shrinking resource envelope, we can still achieve a lot of work, right, with the kind of speed ups that I think are possible here. Okay, So that's it. I've gone a bit over time, I think. Thank you for your attention. If anyone has any quick questions, please shout out. But otherwise, thanks for attending.